Hello everyone, welcome to Angular tutorial series. In this video we are going to cover asynchronous calls. Sometimes in your applications you need to send asynchronous call. Asynchronous means you are not aware how much time your request will take to process. Synchronous and asynchronous call. Synchronous means request and reply. You are sending something, you are getting the response back immediately. But in asynchronous calls, you don't know how much time it will take. Sometimes your backend system, backend REST services will take a time to process the data, whatever you are submitting in HTML form and something. So in that case, we are using asynchronous calls, and for that we will use Angular asynchronous mechanism. So Angular provide a feature to send HTTP calls, which are synchronous, and asynchronous calls. So synchronous, for the synchronous, I think you are clear how to send a call. You have to use $HTTP to send a call. You can use $HTTP.get, $HTTP.post. But the question is how you can do a asynchronous call where you don't know your request will take some time. So that is being done by $Q. $Q is a service. $Q is an ng module in Angular. So using $Q, you will be sending asynchronous call to the backend, and this is called Angular Promise. So a service that helps you to run function asynchronously and use their return values when they are done processing. It means you are sending something, sending a request to backend, and your service or your request is waiting. It is waiting until the response comes back. So there are two things. You send something, you send a call to the backend. Now you are waiting until your service is returning a response. Sometimes it will take some time. Like if your backend systems are slow or backend system are doing a lot of processing for the user input, then it will take a time. So in that case, you have to use this asynchronous mechanism of sending a call to the backend. So promise is not a new concept. It is for the asynchronous calls. So the difference, the basic concept of the promise, the fundamental concept is you are sending something to the backend, then you are waiting until your backend gives a response to you. There are two things. Either your backend system will give you a successful response, or either it will give you an error. Like if you are hitting a particular web service endpoint that doesn't exist, that is failure, that is giving you the failure, or some kind of backend exception you are getting. So if you see this example, $Q, $Q is doing everything that is called Angular promise. So in the terms of Angular, either your request to the backend will get resolved, means you get successful response, or your backend system call will get reject. So there are two things. Either your request will be resolved or either your request will be rejected. So in Angular definition, this is called a promise. You are making a promise to the backend system. Your promise might be resolved or might be rejected. So there are two callbacks: service resolve callback, service reject callback. So here, just in this example, you are calling a function get weather. So here, when you are calling this get weather method, you are not waiting. You are not thinking that this response you will get a quickly response. You have to wait until this method gives a response. So when you get the response, you will fire this then method. I got the response. Maybe it is successful response, maybe it is a failure response. Then you have to fire it like this: service name dot method name dot then. Dot then will be invoked when you get something from the backend. If you got successful, it means whatever the promise you are going to make, you are making with the backend system is fulfilled. Means you got the data. Your promise is successful. You are successfully hitting the backend system, getting the data. But it might be the case that your promise is getting rejected. Then you have to write some console logs to get the data. So here in Angular, in a lot of time you will hear these terms promise, resolve, reject. So promise means you are just making a call to the backend system. If your promise is resolved, it means you got the data. If your promise is rejected, means there is some failure in the backend system, any kind of exception. So now we will take a practical example of this, how to write Angular promise. So if you see, we are creating a factory because we are going to make a backend call. So it is a standardized method that you should write a code in Angular factory or service whenever you are making a synchronous or asynchronous call to the backend. So here, this is a form service. This is a factory I created. I'm injecting $HTTP and $Q. $HTTP is not required. You can remove it. I'm taking care of right now $Q. $Q is an ng object which is making a backend calls. So I created an array of this form service, and form service dot I'm calling this method form service dot submit application. If you look into it, now I created a deferred object q dot defer. So this is the ng object dot defer. So it will give me a deferred object. Now try to understand the code. I mean, you can use the same kind of code while making a backend request. You got the deferred object. Now this deferred request either get resolved or either get rejected. Okay, so this deferred object dot resolved only when you got the data, dot rejected only when you've got failure. So I'm making a call, HTTP call, HTTP post call to this URL. I'm making a post request to the HTTP application info, sending this data. This is success callback, this is failure callback. So now try to understand. Here I'm using HTTP call but in asynchronous way. If you do not write this differ and all, if you're not writing these lines, then it is a similar basic HTTP call. But here what I'm doing, I'm making HTTP call but dealing with the HTTP call in asynchronous way. I created a deferred object. I am posting the data to this post method. I know that this method will take some time in processing, so I will wait. I mean, this method will wait until we got the response. HTTP dot post. It can get a successful response or failure response. So there are two callbacks: success callback and failure callback. So whenever you got a success, then you can resolve this defer object, defer dot resolve. When you get rejection, you have to reject it, defer dot reject, and you have to return this promise so that I can use this promise in controller to call this method. This is one HTTP call. There are other way to call a backend system using resource also, $Q resource also. You can make a backend call. HTTP is a basic method of calling a backend system. We will take a look in advanced tutorials how to make different type of calls to the backend system. Using this HTTP, I'm making this HTTP post call, but I'm resolving this whenever I got the data. I will wait until this promise is resolved. If promise is resolved, then I will just put defer.resolved. If this promise is reject, then I will put defer.reject. Now this is the factory form service. I will inject this factory to my controller, form controller. I'm injecting this here, and now we have already discussed about the form validations, and form has been submitted, so we got the form data. Now I want to send this form data using HTTP post. So now here I will call that service, form service dot submit application, and will pass the data. Here you see these two lines. Form service I have already injected. Submit application form is the method. Submit application form. Submit application form. So this thing will return me a promise. This is my service name. Service is returning the service array. when I call the submit application form, it is returning a promise. So if I have a promise object, then I just need to call dot then over it. Whenever I got the promise from backend system, I need to call dot then so that I can come to know either it is resolved or rejected, right? Because from the tag factory you already saying that if you got the data, it means this promise is resolved. If this is a failure, then it will be rejected. So when you returning the promise, this promise either has been rejected, either has been resolved. Okay. So this promise, default dot promise, if it is resolved, then this section will execute. If it has been rejected, then this section will execute. So this is how we write the Angular promises using HTTP call. The difference, it's a simple HTTP call, but whenever we are sending this call to the backend, we are creating a promise and we are returning a response to the user whenever either promise is resolved, either promise is rejected. So we are returning a promise object. On that promise object, I'm invoking dot then. So it means if success we got promise resolved, then this block will execute. If promise has been rejected by backend system, then this block will execute. So that's all how to write a promise, Angular promise using HTTP. You can create a factory. You can inject the HTTP $q, and this particular service is returning the form service array. You can have multiple, because I created this array because we can have multiple methods here. You can write a multiple methods here. Submit my data or something. You can have multiple methods here, and you will return this form service array. So the using from this service, you can invoke submit data. You can invoke any different kind of methods which you have defined. So form service dot submit application form. Submit application form, this individually I'm invoking, so it will return me a promise. So when it is returning a promise, either this promise has been rejected by the HTTP call or has been resolved. I just need a promise in my controller. Okay, and further I can use a callback methods to evaluate either it is successful or a failure. In the next tutorial, we will take a look how to make the same kind of request without HTTP using resource object. That's all for this for now. Thank you all.